what I learned from Kristen is that there are different conditions in which you trade different ways on that. So it strikes me that one of the issues that you raised made it look like you always trade off in one direction rather than the other. So let me ask my second question because it's related. And it's in response in part to the last question you got. And that's what you're worried about truth tracking as a justification for beliefs. But it may be that this epistemic role that beliefs have is not their only role. So there may be effective roles for belief as well, right? Or, other systems, right, within our organismic complexity that are engaged. And there's a lot of new work in epistemology about the way in which trust and other kinds of moral issues may condition epistemic value, right? So the question I have for you is, how do you deal with the variation of context in which you might trade in favor of type 1 rather than type 2? So if it's about what I'm going to eat and I'm like really hungry, maybe I'll err and eat those things that might be poisonous. But if I'm really, really satiated, then I'm not going to bother, right? I'm going to err on the side of only eating those things I know are going to be good. So I may trade differently under different circumstances. And the other is, what are the other roles for beliefs besides the epistemic truth-tracking one that might be available to an evolutionary account? Okay.
Should I answer that?
Yeah.
Should I answer, or should I wait till we've... Okay. No, look, Sandy's absolutely right about the first point. I just didn't give my talk well enough. The trade-off is purely a function of the value of the four different possible outcomes in a payoff matrix. If it's a matter of, so with predators, for example, you really don't want to not believe that there is a predator when there is a predator. Right. That's a very bad thing. But as the behavior of one of our most unpleasant invasive pests in Australia, the cane toad, demonstrates, if you're a male and I'm not sure whether this is a female cane toad or not, should I copulate with it? The answer the cane toad had is yes, if there's any possibility greater than 0 that it might conceivably be a female cane toad, then I should copulate with it because it doesn't cost very much and there's a possible benefit. Absolutely. What I was trying to get at, which I think is the real reply, so I think there's this kind of superficial idea which says, oh, well, evolution doesn't care about truth, it only cares about fitness, so there's epistemology out the window. What I'm trying to say is even the simplest way of thinking about that shows you that there's an epistemic dynamic in which what you're trying to do is to buy as much truth as you can given the costs of various kinds of error. But it's basically about maximizing, the amount of knowledge that you get, given that you can't have perfect omniscient knowledge, and different kinds of errors have different costs. So it seems to me that gives us quite a good fundamental reply to that sort of thing. As for the effective stuff, you're absolutely right. I mean, most of the biases are, if you want a lot of good stuff on cognitive biases, there are effective biases. Then you need to tell a story about, debugging your own cognitive systems when you become reflective about epistemology. One of the things you might want to do is to engage in a kind of self-debugging exercise. So the idea is that we can sort of bootstrap our way into, I think the way to understand, I didn't talk about science, but the way to understand the relationship of science and common sense, if you want to defend the kind of program that I'm trying to sketch there, is one in which science is basically a kind of a systematic self-debugging exercise.
Yes, I would like to ask Sandra about a lot of questions, actually, because we share a lot, and I would like to speak this and this, but I have only one question, perhaps. The issue you touched at the end of your intervention, that is the issue of causality. If you don't think that eventually a little bit what I have presented about formal constraints and top-down processes could, in a certain sense, go in that direction, or what is your opinion about that?
Okay, I think I agree entirely with you. Is the short
me
answer?
Me too.
Which is, I think, what I'm suggesting is that what you're describing, I think, is characteristic of a lot of systems that scientists are unraveling now, and that what as a philosopher one needs to do is upgrade the philosophical conception to accommodate a much more nuanced and variable and pluralistic account of causality. Not all I mean, it's, you know, it's a long time since Descartes. It's not all contact force, it's not even all action at a distance. Now we have a lot of other ways in which the world, through our best scientific investigation, presents its causal structure, and we should figure out how, I mean, and I think there's positive sorts, but I can't go into it at this point, but that we need a framework, a conceptual framework that steps up to the kinds of complexities that you were displaying in your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, I mean, I was not able to fully absorb the content of Professor Arletta's talk. It was very rich. I mean, I have always been profoundly sympathetic to basically systems views of. I was very interested to see linking. I mean, the way you distinguish teleonomy and teleology was new to me, and I mean, I've thought a lot about Baldwin effects. That's something which I actually prefer not to call them Baldwin effects because I think it's very clear that the name Baldwin effect was induced deliberately by George Gaylord Simpson in order to heap opprobrium upon that whole way of evolutionary thinking. So, I mean, he stuck Baldwin's name onto it in order to try and bring it into disrepute. So I'd sort of prefer stick Mary Jane West Eberhard's name onto it instead. But I think the idea, and I think if you think about it in terms of West Eberhard's work, the idea that in order to make sense of that idea of behavior kind of guiding the direction of evolution, you need to have a theory of the internal generation of purpose. That's something I'm 100% on board with. And I also, of course, very sympathetic to the idea that complex systems are able to act teleologically and that that's relevant to understanding their ability to choose their niche. But I must admit I didn't fully understand the way in which you were making the distinction between these two kinds of teleology and complex systems, and that's something I need to go away and think about.
First of all, okay, thank you. First of all, I know I have even quoted. I have recently submitted to a publishing house a manuscript on this issue, and I have quoted your paper on Baldwin and Simpson. I know that they agree. So it is only for me. It is only name actually, but I agree with the analysis. And about, I know that the distinction between teleonomy and teleology could be not so evident, but probably I could say this in a very short form. That is, both are process of codatation, if you will. Only that you have teleonomy when there is no information control, and you have teleology when there is information control. Okay. This is the point. And if you like, they are also entrenched. I agree with you. So it is very difficult to disentangle the two, especially in epigenetic processes. They are deeply entrenched. So it is, but it is very important to understand that. Let me say, if we would be schematically here, I would say that in phylogeny, you have a prevalence of teleonomy and so of divergent processes, even if there are also convergences, as nicely shown by Conway Morris this morning. When you have ontogeny, you have, on the contrary, especially convergent processes and information control. In epigeny, you have continuously divergent and convergent processes, continuously. That is, the whole patterns are built in a way in which continuously you have a divergence and convergence, divergence and convergence. It's very interesting. So you have a mix of the two. And this explains to me in which sense the enterprise of Ivo Divo is justified. That is, in the sense that actually, indeed, development is the crucial stage in which eventually phylogenetic effects can be active or more have more impact or so. And finally, I totally agree. I mean, West Eberhard is also for me a reference point. So it is clear that her work is widely quoted in my own, so I totally agree with that. As I have mentioned at the beginning, my own work is based on a lot of other works, and I do not pretend to tell something completely new.
Bill Carroll from Oxford. As a British member of Parliament might say to Professors Mitchell and Auletta, would the right honourable members agree with me when I comment about the discussion of causality that you have both talked about in some considerable extent, that the developments with complexity, with self-organization in biological systems, that contemporary biology, and not only contemporary biology, but here we're primarily interested in contemporary biology, has revealed the poverty of causality understood as an epistemological category, and encourages us to think, perhaps with Aristotle or with some others, to return causality to the category of metaphysical dependence, which does not exclude epistemological questions, but that in the last few hundred years, as you mentioned from Descartes on, to consider causality primarily or exclusively in terms of prediction, in terms of epistemology, appears to be breaking down in the context of developments of contemporary science, and in particular biology. And this shows us perhaps the need to return to a richer notion of causality, primarily in the area of metaphysics.
Can I briefly respond? Yes and no, I guess. I agree with you that as far as my allegiances are more to a physical notion, a physical causal notion rather than an epistemic one, an ontological causal notion. And the way I've been thinking about it is in terms of varying degrees of dependence. So I think dependence is really the critical notion, and many of the models we have of causality, if you like, reify a particularly strong form of dependence as what is diagnostic of causality, and therefore make it invisible to that analysis all the kinds of varying degrees and powers of dependence or contingency that actually the world is presenting to us. So I agree with you that it shouldn't just be, it has to have an epistemological correlate, and then we have all the problems with the fact that we're representing it in some conceptual framework. Those are part of it. But I would agree that the causality should be an ontological or metaphysical, at least an attempt to capture something ontological and metaphysical.
I totally agree. Until the last word.
This may be wrong-headed in light of the past question, but as a scientist, I would like to see those epistemological procedures reified. I'd like to find ways to test those kinds of ideas. So Sandra brought this point up, and I'd just like to ask perhaps all three of you, if we're asking how do we get knowledge of complex causal systems, Sandra suggested a pluralist approach, and usually I'm very sympathetic to that, but trying to defend that to a bunch of scientists, the next question that most of them have for me is, well, which one's more important? Or which one is more important, or how are they dependent? You want to try that one, any of you?
Briefly, I think pluralism is only part of the story, pragmatism is another part of the story. So the answer is, depends on what you want to do. Which is more important? There's many things we want to do in engaging the world and many kinds of knowledge we want to have on it. I don't think there's a univocal answer to that.
Absolutely. We need to change a little bit our mind here, I think, because we cannot presume, when we deal with a certain complexity, we cannot presume always to have a description in terms of a trajectory or a dynamics of a single system, because they're most unpredictable. What we need to single out are the general characters of several systems. That is, which did a certain shift in the way in which we consider the problems here. So the predictions cannot be done about single behaviors, but predictions can be done about classes of behaviors. This is different. Yeah. So in this way, I agree totally with Sandra. It is about the fact that we need to, because it is, if you will, the epistemological side of what you say. That is, we need to go out from a true, I would say, elementary understanding of causality. Because, I mean, dynamic causality in traditional sense is only one of the components of our world. For instance, we have a very interesting quantum mechanical examples of that, because, for instance, when you have two coins, and you can throw these coins and have a head and cross, okay? If they would be completely independent, you would obtain always 4 possibilities, one of the 4, and in the longer time run, you would have an equidistribution of the 4. That is cross-cross, head-head, head-cross, and cross-head. These are the 4 possibilities. Now, the interesting point is that already at the quantum mechanical level, so a very elementary one, in certain situations, in states called the secret state, where you have entanglement, you have only, for instance, this is now a possibility, head-cross or cross-head, but never head-head, cross-cross. So so this confines somehow the randomicity of the events. So what we have here, a causality in the traditional sense of the word? Not at all, because we have no transmission of signal. And without the transmission of signal, we cannot have causality in the traditional sense of the word. But notwithstanding, we have a causal constraints, because we have a subset of the initial possibility. So we have something that it is somehow real, if you allow this word, that constrains certain events.
Paul, this is directed at you. In asking the question of whether there's a link or correlation between truth and fitness, the one question one would have to ask is, how do you sort of give content to beliefs? And the cane toad example made me think of the Fleabee literature, and if you have some kind of a teleosemantics where you're actually using selection stories to give contents to beliefs, then you can have a link between truth and beliefs, but it's question begging because it's built in. You get it for free. So the question is, if you are wanting to make that argument in a non-question begging way, especially for non-human animals, how do you ascribe content?
You've got the whole kind of structure of the paper there, Grant. Yes, that's why I followed it up with my perhaps not entirely coherent discussion of Jakob von Uexküll. So yes, if there's a tendency, and I don't have a fully worked out answer to this, but there's clearly a tendency for your account of the content of representational states to get mixed up with your account of why they're a good thing.
Right.
And that's why I'm trying to argue that you are not going to be able to get a straightforward, strong form of realism about the world that emerges from. So you've got this story about the evolution of representational states. Then you say, what do those representational states say? What are they representing the world as being? And you get a highly organism-centered conception of what the world is, and that's why I use this Umwelt idea to kind of get
But
that.
you think you can give that story
Then what
without folding selection?
Well, here's the strategy that John, as you know, this is a joint paper with John, so I shouldn't entirely speak for him, but I also shouldn't suggest it's just my strategy. The strategy we're following up is one of saying, well, that's going to get you something like a structural realist story, which is probably the biggest goer for realism in the current literature. So it's going to get you the right kind of scientific realism anyway, a rather ameliorated kind of. So you're going to get a structural realist story out of it. That's the hope. When we finish the paper, we'll see whether we can convince you of that. But you've got the whole strategy, yes. That's right.
All right, thanks.
My name is Bernard Wood, and this is also a question for the last speaker, and this is a difficult, this may not be easy to answer, but could you think of something that might be accessible through the archaeological record which would be the equivalent of the sort of golden character that I was looking for but haven't been able to find, that you would say, here is evidence of a modern human mind.
Wow. Yeah. It would have something to do with, and this is totally off the top of my head, it's not an issue, I haven't thought about it in that kind of human evolution perspective. It would be something to do with the emergence of, and this would also, actually I'm feeling more confident about saying this because it relates quite close to some of the things that Ruth Millikan said on this topic. It would be the emergence of that idea of a continuing object which is identical across many different behavioral repertoires, which is what's missing from, say, the world of the bird. The idea that rather than a particular stimulus situation calling forth a particular kind of behavior, rather I've got re-identifiable particulars which are independent of any particular behavioral repertoire that I'm going to produce. So there's this thing, and that thing can be something which whether I'm mating with it or using it to throw, I mean, it's the same thing across all those contexts, which Millikan would relate to the idea of being able to go through multiple different sensory modalities, but represent it as being the same object, no matter how you access it. That might not get you the modern human mind, but it would get you high-level representations. If we found that other animals were doing that, we ought to have more respect for their cognition.
Thank you very much.